This is Convention Night in Review, Thursday, August 20th, 1992. From Houston, site of the 1992 Republican Convention, here's moderator Paul Duke.
Good evening. Day 4 of the Republican Convention is over, a grand finale night in which President Bush pledged to lead a new crusade to make America stronger and safer, to win re-election on the themes of trust, family values, and economic revival. The president's acceptance speech followed a fiery address by Vice President Dan Quayle, who called the Republicans the true voice for change in the United States. Assessment and analysis for this final night from 3 members of our Washington Week team. Michelle McQueen of the Wall Street Journal, Stephen Roberts of U.S. News and World Report, and Jack Nelson of the Los Angeles Times. And a bit later, we'll have a special report from our Washington Week colleague, Hedrick Smith, back in Washington. Jack, George Bush said he would come out fighting, and he has.
Well, he has, and I thought that for this crowd anyway in the convention hall, it was a dynamite speech. He did define Clinton the way he said he would, as a tax and spender, as somebody who was weak on foreign affairs, weak on defense. So I think for this audience, it was terrific. I'm not so sure what sort of a speech it was for outside the audience. However, I think that people, particularly businessmen who were thinking that he might do something about laying out an economic plan to do something about the deficit, probably are disappointed in it. And so my guess is that it's not going to be that well received in many places outside the convention hall.
4 years ago in New Orleans, Steve, George Bush made the speech of his life. And tonight, he was given the task of making the speech of his life number 2. Did he succeed?
I don't think he did. I think all week the Republicans and Bush advisors were engaged in this great game of trying to lower expectations. They were very afraid, Paul, that people would build this up to the point where they thought that they would be somehow see a new George Bush, a reborn George Bush. We saw a feisty George Bush. We saw a combative George Bush. We saw a vigorous George Bush. We didn't see a new George Bush. And people who thought that they would see a new George Bush are going to have to be disappointed.
We certainly didn't see a kinder, gentler George Bush tonight, Michelle, because he had quite a few zingers in his address.
I know. I kept expecting Bill Clinton to make a surprise appearance because they kept calling him. I thought maybe he'd be conjured up at some point. I mean, if he really was the featured attraction here. I don't think this convention was so much about defining George Bush as it was about defining Bill Clinton.
We heard so much in the period preceding the convention and even at the convention here itself that George Bush finally would deal with what they call the vision thing. You seem to be suggesting that he didn't really deal with that as many people had anticipated tonight.
I don't think he did. You know, it's very interesting for the whole of this election campaign. We've been saying over and over again on Washington Week and other shows that change was the buzzword of the year. And in many ways, what George Bush tried to do tonight was change the idea of change into something different. First of all, he has no credibility as an agent of change because he's been in office 11 years and his pollsters have told him that. And so he kept trying to say what really is, I'm the manager of change, not the agent of change. And that if you really want to change the Congress, not the White House. So I think this was not a particularly uplifting or forward-looking speech. And I don't think people who are restless with the status quo are going to get a great deal to hang on to from it.
Can I say, I don't think that his problem is the vision thing. I think his problem is the follow-up thing. I think that voters have accepted the fact that he has a limited view, particularly in the domestic area. Where he has really failed is not in giving a good speech. He's given some good speeches. Where he's failed is in following through on the things that he's proposed. Does anybody remember the State of the Union address? He had some credible proposals there. He didn't seem to really fight for them. Does he have enough time to fight for these? I'm not sure.
But in this speech tonight, he certainly did take the attack to the Democrats, and the Democrats have clearly been under attack all week long here. And the president's speech was kind of the final summary of all the assaults against Bill Clinton and the Democrats. The president made it clear that the Democratic-controlled Congress is going to be one of his main targets. He did lay out a few specific things which he's really going to go for.
I think one of the most interesting and provocative proposals is this idea for a checkup. But I'm afraid that
what was that?
It's a proposal to allow taxpayers to sort of take the deficit into their own hands, to dedicate a portion of their tax revenues to specifically paying down the deficit. And he says in order to pay for it, he would reduce government spending by dollar for dollar by an equal amount. He's going to allow taxpayers to put up to 10% of their tax receipts. Now, if you figure that individuals pay the government about $500 billion in individual tax receipts every year, 10% of that would be $50 billion. Is he really going to cut government spending by $50 billion across the board? I don't know. And that can be made into a very scary proposal. I think we're going to hear the G word a lot over the weekend, gimmick. It's a lot like the president's payroll tax proposal at the beginning of the year, where he reduced he changed the withholding tables to change people's take-home pay. It was about $1 a week for most American families. This is a much more provocative, much more controversial proposal.
Oh, what a lot of Republicans were saying before this, though, they thought that George Bush really did have to lay out an economic plan that would do something about the deficit, because, you know, there are leading Republicans in this country who think in the few years ahead, in a second George Bush term, if there is a second George Bush term, the economy will almost go into a state of collapse if we don't do something about the budget deficit. And he really didn't lay out anything there about that. Look at Ross Perot. Look at Ross Perot, who ran and who made that the central part of his program. I would have thought, for example, he might have even picked up on a couple of Perot's proposals, but he didn't really do that.
But Jack, we have to make this point, that the Republicans have been sharply divided over which way to go. Now, the president decided to go with the supply-siders who've been pushing him to emphasize tax cuts over the federal deficit.
But there's not
and
much
there is that theory abroad among economists that you shouldn't worry that much about the deficit, that at a time when the country is not doing very well economically, it's much more important to emphasize pro-growth policies.
But I don't think that there is a lot of division out there among leading Republican businessmen that something must be done about the deficit, Paul.
You know, I also talked to a strategist today who said, look, the point is the man, not the plan. That the details of these plans are not going to be what people are going to take home from this convention in this speech. What they're going to take home is a sense of whether George Bush understands the economic problems in this country, understands the trials American families are going through, and whether he's prepared to devote his time and his energy to doing something about it. The details are not important. And what I was very struck with, Paul, tonight, was there was only about one brief paragraph in this whole speech devoted to reaching out to these troubled Americans and saying, you know, I really understand your problems. And the biggest problem George Bush has in every poll is that people think he's disconnected from their lives. And this is one of my questions. I don't know whether the people listening at home felt that they were listening to a president who really understood their problems and really cared about them.
Well, can I just briefly give the administration view on the deficit? I've talked to a lot of their economic advisors in recent weeks, and it is a fact that they believe that the deficit will be dropping on its own if no one does anything, and that's because the savings and loan bailout will have been paid off. So they believe that the deficit is going to come down anyway without taking any further action. That's one reason that they can go out on a limb with these kinds of proposals.
And furthermore, doesn't the president make a good point when he says that a lot of his economic proposals have indeed been torpedoed by the Democrats on Capitol Hill? For example, there are wide differences in view about the approach to deal with the economy, but certainly there is an economic school of thought that believes reducing the capital gains tax will encourage economic growth, will help to bring the economy back, whether that's right or wrong.
It was interesting, too, though, talking about the reaction of this audience, one of the biggest hands that he got in this audience when he brought up capital gains again. I mean, that's very interesting.
Because that is Republican religion in an economic sense.
But a lot of these ideas are fairly tired. We've heard about capital gains, we've heard about the line item veto, we've heard about balanced budget. People who are looking for something new heard a lot of very familiar themes. I think in some ways the strongest element of the economic part of the speech was a negative one in a sense, which was attacking the Democrats on taxes. If there is one issue on which the Democrats are vulnerable in this election, it's the belief that no matter what they say, they're going to raise people's taxes. It's the same problem the Republicans used to have about Social Security. Every time they mentioned Social Security, they lost points in the polls.
It was interesting,
I think it's very similar.
It was interesting, too, that he did finally say that he made a real mistake. I mean, he said it at the convention here, which was, I thought...
But I think if you talk to voters around this country, one of the single biggest vulnerabilities Clinton has and biggest openings Bush has is to convince people that he really is going to raise their taxes. And as Bush says, he's defined someone as rich as anybody who has a job. And that is the line that many people will get frightened by.
Over and beyond the specifics of the economic proposals the president was talking about tonight, did we get any kind of sense of what a second Bush administration would be like?
Well, it really depends a lot on the Congress. I think the president was even explicit about this fact. A lot of the proposals he has for the economy really depend on having the support of members of Congress. It is a very dubious pillar on which to base his presidency. He says that he's going to sit down with every new member, regardless of party, and try to inoculate them against these special interests lying in wait to capture their fresh thinking. Well, the polls right now look as though the Democrats are still going to be in control of this Congress, and whether they're going to be prepared to play ball with the president on these proposals is an open question.
Yeah, the polls look so bad for some of the congressmen running for re-election and some of the Republican candidates that they would just as soon the president had quit bashing Congress because they're very concerned they're not going to get elected.
But the polls also show, the latest polls, some of which came in tonight, that the Republicans may indeed get a significant bounce from this convention. The gap is now narrowing between the president and Bill Clinton. And so this convention and the president's speech tonight may indeed help Mr. Bush.
Oh, there's no doubt that simply by dominating the television for 4 days, simply by getting a chance to broadcast their message, including their negative messages, raising the negatives of Clinton, frightening people about what a Clinton administration would be, stressing the fact that this is a very inexperienced person, that crack about the leader of the Arkansas National Guard, is that the guy you really want to take over the Pentagon? I think that there's no doubt that Bush is going to get a bump from this. The question is whether it's a short-term bump or whether it really changes people's minds. And this goes to this question of whether they really believe the next 4 years will be different. You say, do we know about a next Bush administration? The chant out here, 4 more years, that might be the bad news as well as the good news, because if people think it'll be 4 more years of the same, that's not necessarily a winning idea.
But what the president tried to do tonight, I think, was to project an image that he would provide the country with 4 more years of stability and coherence in foreign policy, and because there is a certain stability now on the foreign front, that we can move ahead on the economic front.
Well, that's part of what I said, Paul, that I really think he's trying to sell to the people that change is not what it's cracked up to be. And you don't want to take too much of a risky change. And he even said, it's time to go back to our roots. It's time to go back to traditions. This is not necessarily the ringing call for radical change at all.
Dan Quayle set the place on fire tonight.
I thought it was a good speech. I thought, and this is different for him, it was a better speech delivered than it was to read it. And that says that it was him speaking.
A new Dan Quayle?
No, I think it was the old Dan Quayle. I think he was speaking, I think the speech truly reflected him. I mean, it wasn't the most elegant speech. I don't think it's going to go be cited by speech crafters in years to come, but I do think it gave you a sense of the man.
He's a little bit like Clinton in this respect. He's still standing after having taken the hits for about 3 years now. And I think that he made the most of that by saying, I stand here, despite all of my critics, I survived, I'm going to be the candidate again.
What I noticed about the Quayle speech is what he talked about that George Bush did not, Paul. He obviously had the assignment, whether he chose it for himself or someone gave it to him, to talk about a lot of the cultural issues and the moral values. He talked, for instance, in rather hard-edged terms, that there is a right way to bring up children. There is a right way to run a family.
As indeed his wife did last night.
That there is a cultural divide, as he said. Dan Quayle has been trying now for months to get people, he said it very explicitly in his speech tonight, to get people out there to think, you know, the Democrats are looking down on you and they're even laughing at you. I thought that was very strong, and I thought that it was interesting that Bush hardly touched those issues at all. You never heard the word abortion, for instance, from George Bush. That's all we've talked about for 3 days a year. You never heard the word in George Bush's speech.
Never came up. Our colleague, Hedrick Smith, has been watching tonight's convention proceedings back in our Washington studio. Rick, what do you think?
Well, I think first of all, Paul, on the television screen in the living room and up here, George Bush looked strong, he looked healthy, he looked stable, he looked confident, he looked relaxed. You saw him switch from kind of slashing attacks on Clinton and making fun of him to telling stories about what it was like to be on his submarine and looking out at the horizon. So you had a very different picture of Bush than you've had recently, embattled, questions about his health, so forth. So I think the personal impression of the president was very good. I think his delivery was good, and that helped him a lot. It probably gave him a boost just simply to deliver a speech that well. On foreign policy, it seems to me he did, as some others have commented, draw a very sharp contrast between his experience and what had happened on his watch. You would hardly remember that George Bush had been slow to back the Baltic republics and slow to promote German reunification and slow on a number of things. You would have thought he was out in front of all of them. But I really think that on the domestic issue, I kept waiting for it. I kept waiting to hear some real talk about what to do about unemployment, what to do about poverty, what to do to generate some growth here in the economy. He even made fun of Clinton at one point, saying that Clinton had found a new word for taxation, investment. Well, to most Americans, investment is a good word, investing in Americans' future, whether it's training or jobs or new business and so forth. I think the only real sales pitch he made for Bush policies in the future in the economic area has to do with the North American trade agreement he signed last week with Canada and Mexico. And I think he's got to make that case yet. There are an awful lot of people in Detroit and in the Middle West, where there's going to be a real battleground for this election, who see Mexico as a rival to America and who fear that this trade agreement is going to mean moving even more factories down there. So I think that I'd agree with Steve, sitting from this end, it didn't look as though he made the economic case to the have-nots. The haves had lots of things, tax incentives, Clinton's going to be worse.
Rick, let me ask you this question. How do you think the president's speech will go over with the people who had left the Republican Party and had gone to Ross Perot?
You know, I think the president's taken a real gamble here. It struck me as I was listening. These are people, as Jack Nelson was saying earlier, these are people who are very much concerned about the deficit, and he didn't really have much for them on that issue. These are also people who are absolutely sick and tired of the political blame game. The president even acknowledged that in his speech by saying he didn't like the blame game, other people didn't like it. So his very sharp partisan attacks on Congress may not play so well with these voters too. I don't think that he, except on foreign policy, really did much to bring the Perot people back. And I would also wonder about the Reagan Democrats, the blue-collar people. The pitch on social values that Dan Quayle made, on those issues perhaps they may have helped with the Reagan Democrats. But I would say that in the two groups of voters that the president most needed to reach, the Perot supporters and the old Reagan Democrats, he only did a fair job. I don't think he made a convincing case.
And let me say this too, Paul. I think that Ross Perot was watching very carefully to see what the president was going to say. I was talking today with former Treasury Secretary John Connolly, who, as you know, worked for a while there with Perot when he was still talking about running for president. He would not be surprised, he said, if Perot doesn't come out and endorse Clinton before it's over, because he thinks George Bush is not going to address the deficit problem, and he thinks it's going to be disastrous for the economy of the United States if he doesn't do it. And that is a view that's shared by a lot of leading business people.
Let me ask you, those of you who've been here covering this convention, Rick just referred a moment ago to the politics of blame, and there has been a lot of that. It's been attack against the Democrats, against gays, against Hillary Clinton. Do you think this is selling?
I think that there was so much of it at this convention, I must say, that in some respects I think it's got to backfire. And I think that the attacks on Hillary Clinton must be backfiring, Paul.
As a matter of fact,
but it was interesting, though, that that the president himself in his speech said something about we can't have all of these personal attacks, and then turns right around and makes a personal attack.
As a matter of fact, there's a new poll out just tonight that shows that by a better than 2-to-1 margin, voters who were polled feel that the Republicans have overdone their criticism of Hillary Clinton, and that the attacks against her have been unfair. Don't you think that during these 4 days here in Houston, that the Republicans have basically sent out a muddled message to the country?
Well, they sent out a muddled message to some degree to their own troops here on the floor. You talk about the social issues and the blame game, for instance. I talked to a number of people last night. Take Senator John Chafee, a senior senator from Rhode Island, a moderate in the party. He was standing there just outraged at some of the things he had heard from the podium in his own party, particularly the attacks on gays, the attacks on Hillary Clinton. He was just simmering.
As a matter of fact, Lynn Martin, who was the keynoter last night, not the keynoter, she nominated George Bush. said today that she felt that that some of the speakers had gone too far.
But you know, they would explain that was done to shore up their base. They would say that
they sure have spent a lot of time doing that.
They have, because they were very worried that the Republican right wing would defect on them. I don't know quite to whom, but they were worried about it.
It's a risky strategy. It's very important for an incumbent president to choose his targets carefully, because I think it's easier for people to think that the incumbent is being mean, taking it too far, using the advantages of his office in an unfair way. So I think he's got to be careful about that. Elections are, however, about choosing between A or B. That's one reason they've got to be polarizing to some degree. The question is, do they take it too far? I think they might have, because the problem is that the Republican Party is still the minority party. They've got to reach out if they want to grow. If they succeed in alienating everybody who doesn't agree with every single thing on this platform, they can't
And
win.
what people ought to understand, too, is these are not freelancers up there speaking. All of those speeches went right through the very well orchestrated convention of the president. So President Bush knew what people were saying, or at least his top aides did.
We just have a few moments left now for a final assessment. New York certainly proved that the Democrats are alive and are ready to make a real fight for the White House again. What did this convention, what did these 4 days tell us then about the Republican Party?
I think it told us that it's a Republican Party that's divided. It's divided on economic policy very clearly. It's divided along cultural and social lines. The country clubbers versus the Born Again Christians, for instance, and the blue collar Republicans. And yet it's also true. It's a Republican Party that knows how to win presidential elections. They trotted out a lot of the old lines which have worked for 20 years, and I, for one, am not ready to bet against them yet. I think that when it comes to presidential politics, they've got a very good case to make. They understand what moves voters, and I think they've made a good start toward getting back in the race.
It says that they haven't figured out how to be both inclusive and true to their original intentions and what they view as their original conservative principles.
Paul, to be frank with you, I think there was more extremism showed at this particular convention than anything I've seen since 1964.
You said you felt that the Republican Party has been taken over by the religious right.
Well, I do think they have been. I don't think there's much question about that. I think they control this convention. I think it was Ed Rollins, who is a Republican and a Republican strategist, who said it is now the core of the party. And that if it continues in that direction, that it's not going to bode well for the party. And he thinks that there's a chance that Clinton could win, as he calls it, a wipeout, in which cases he says it could be that the Republicans maybe wouldn't regain the White House for 16 years. Now, that may be rather drastic. It may not be what most people think, but there's a leading Republican strategist who feels that way about it.
Winners and losers at this convention.
Well, I think among the winners, particularly among those who were aspiring for 96, this was clearly spring training for 1996. Those who were still struggling to finish the 1992 campaign were sort of aghast at the notion of 96 already. But I think Jack Kemp helped himself a lot at this convention. He gave a strong speech.
He was gracious.
And he was also one of the most forward-looking and dynamic. In a sea of negativism, where a lot of the speeches were focused on what was wrong with the Democrats, he was one of the few who tried to lay out a practical and a rather elevating vision. And I think he was the one who did himself the most good.
I agree with Jack Kemp, certainly, and I'm going to also say Dan Quayle, because I think he did what he set out to do, which is to give himself a fresh start.
Well, I'm going to surprise you because I think Pat Buchanan was the winner, because Pat Buchanan appealed to the core of the party here, and they loved him. I think that he sort of owns the future of the party the way it now stands.
But George Bush was not a winner at this convention.
Well, he was a winner in the sense that he survived. He didn't make any great mistakes. I think people are going to go out with a warm feeling, but not a very vibrant or excited feeling. It's kind of a B plus feeling, but it's not an A.
Losers?
I am going to disagree with my colleague here and say that I think Patrick Buchanan was. I think there were a lot of delegates on the floor who were outraged at some of the things that he said.
Yeah, but
I think that they
this
think that
wasn't the religious right,
they
though.
think that he is not. Well, that's certainly true, but I think that again, the Republicans want to be the majority party. They don't think that's the way to do it.
A loser?
A loser.
Phil Gramm. I thought that Phil Gramm was built up to make a major keynote address, and I thought it was basically a negative carping kind of speech that really didn't set any sort of a positive theme for the president or for the Republican Party.
Well, my loser, I agree that Buchanan set a very negative and angry tone, and I think polarized people in the wrong way. He polarized more people against him than for him. I also would add that Don Nichols, who's the chairman of the Platform Committee, they succeeded in passing a platform that in many key areas is out of step not only with the mainstream of America, but the mainstream of their own party. And I think in trying to satisfy a sliver of the religious right, they did themselves some harm, so I think he's a loser too.
With the conventions, both conventions now over, what will the bumper stickers say tomorrow morning about this presidential race?
I so hate to cheapen our language, but I really think slippery when wet is going to thing we're going to carry away from this. The president's line about Bill Clinton. I think that's the thing that sticks.
If you can have a long one, it would be George bit the bullet and Bill bit his nails.
I think that there are two bumper stickers. One is "It's not my fault," which is basically what the Republicans are trying to say, or alternatively, "We know things are bad, but they could be worse." And that's what they're counting on to really win this election.
Trust
is that
me,
feeling.
that's another one.
Is it Bill Clinton's race still to lose at this point?
I think in many ways it is a referendum still on Bill Clinton. I think that it's not really about George Bush. It's about whether people come to trust Bill Clinton, and he took some hits here. Questions whether he can survive it.
Well, it's all over. 5 days from now, all of this in the background will become a baseball park again, Steve. They criticize conventions as being outdated and boring and just political coronations, but I think they still amount to one of the grand hurrahs of American politics. And we've been privileged to bring you these special Convention Nights in Review programs. My thanks to all of you, our reporters who performed in such great style, and to all the other people who made this program possible. I'm Paul Duke. Good night for all of us for Convention Night in Review.
He's one of the world's most popular motivational speakers, and this Sunday from 3 until 7, Les Brown will host two of his most inspiring PBS specials, You Deserve and Take Charge of Your Life. It's a Les Brown afternoon this Sunday from 3 to 7 on WVIZ.
For a transcript, send $4 to Convention Night in Review, Journal Graphics, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203. Or call 303-831-9000.